Well, shock tactics, I think, in the reading today. Shock tactics. I think Jesus could have well used that same advertising agency who make those TV advertisements about road safety. You know, the one that's been playing for years where the two cars are going to crash and they stop and get out and there's a child in the car and they talk, but they know that there's nothing they can do to stop it happening. Or those rather gruesome videos that are shown to young people to put them off smoking. It's all about shock tactics and making us stop and think and try and change our behaviour. I think there's some of that going on in our gospel this morning. Jesus has gathered his disciples on Mount Tabor above the Sea of Galilee, and they settle in for a long teaching session. We usually call it the Sermon on the Mount. And it starts off, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who hunger," and it goes steadily downhill from there. If the disciples or those listening thought that they were getting ready perhaps to A, overthrow the Romans, or B, overthrow the high priests, or C, get on the fast track to heaven, they are soon deeply disappointed. They're soon shocked and wide awake and probably sloping off down the hill thinking, there's no point staying with this teacher, it's really way too hard. Moses had taught them many centuries earlier that they had two choices. They could choose life and prosperity, or they could choose death and adversity. Obeying the commandments would bring life, turning away would bring death. And so people were reasonably careful to try and obey the commandments, from the big ones, like you'll have no other gods but me, down to the little details in the law, like don't mix wool and linen when making your clothes. There were laws and rules for everything, what you ate and what you wore, and how you behaved in community. And they were designed to build community and to make the people ready to worship God. The prophets warned the people through the century that their hearts also had to be in the right place. It wasn't just about the rules. The rules were there, many of them for good reason, but your heart also had to be in the right place. Isaiah gives advice about fasting, saying it's all very well to follow the rules of fasting, but if you're doing it for show and not for the right reasons, there's no point. He says, "Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free?" And so there was an underlying attitude that they had to have in their hearts as well. And so Jesus, I think, picks up from that but takes it way further. He says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." Now, first of all, no other teacher or rabbi or scribe would set their own sayings alongside the sayings of the Torah, the law and teaching of God. You have heard it said, but I say to you. That, in his context, was another shock tactic. Who would dare to contradict the Torah? Nobody would. But Jesus is actually not really contradicting it, but going underneath it and enhancing it. Charles Campbell says, Jesus moves several traditional commands that are beneath outward actions to the deep places where life-giving relationships are grounded. So he goes deeper. He says, don't simply refrain from murder, but avoid anger and insult and seek reconciliation with your enemy. Don't just refrain from adultery, but treat others as people of value rather than objects of lust. Moses' choices of life or death are choices for a life-giving life, not just based on rules, but on deep commitment to God and to each other. And so Jesus is bringing that out of the Torah. And all the commentators point out that these passages in Matthew 5 are not addressed to Jesus' followers as individuals, but as members of the people of God, the community of God. Stanley Hauer says, you cannot live by the demands of the Sermon on the Mount on your own, but that's the point. The demands of the sermon are designed to make us depend on God and depend on one another. He says our only hope of living as the community of the sermon is to acknowledge that we do not retaliate or hate or curse or swear or brag or preen or worry or backbite. We don't do all those things because it's not in the nature of our God that we should be such a people. That is not the way that we were created. So then the sermon's not a list of requirements, but rather a description of the life of the people who are gathered around Jesus. And the things that will happen to us if we don't get it right, like being thrown into prison or hell or cutting off of limbs, well, that's part of the shock tactics. Jesus uses hyperbole often. We're not really supposed to take it literally, but it is a heads up to take things seriously because we do have choices. We do choose life or death, prosperity or adversity. The last part of our reading today talks about oaths. Do not swear by heaven or Jerusalem, let your word be enough. Simply say yes or no. In Jesus' day, there weren't written contracts for things. You took an oath, which kind of made your words stronger. And apparently there were different grades of oath for different things, depending on the level of the contract. And this too had got very legalistic and very confusing. So Jesus says, simply say yes or say no. Let your word be enough. Choose life or not. It's up to you. We all make choices every day. We say yes or no to things every minute of every day. You've all said no to something else in order to come to church today. No to a brunch or a lie in bed with breakfast, although you are getting a picnic after church today. Each day we make a choice to pray or to not, to spend time with people who need us or not. All of our choices have consequences. Saying yes and no in a conscious way and thinking through our choices is a kind of spiritual discipline or practice. We think of the more obvious spiritual practices like hospitality or forgiveness or worship or prayer. But one writer says, what about saying yes and no? Learning how and when to say yes and no is a practice that is crucial in our attempt to choose life. Saying yes and no are companions in the process of constituting a whole and holy life. We don't have to say yes to everything. And we do need to say no to some things, but we make choices, yes and no. And those choices matter whether we're individuals, and our choices as communities matter. We're watching the devastating effects of electoral choices in the US at the moment. We're going to have our own choices to make this election year. In our voting, we assent to certain ideas and we say no to others. We're coming up soon to Lent, and during Lent we're going to be thinking about water, about the choices we make as individuals and as a country in our use and misuse of water. We'll be discovering and thinking about the water of our baptism. The water of our baptism brings us into a community of faith. At the moment of baptism, we choose life, or life is chosen for us by our parents and godparents. What do we need to do together to help us to continue to choose life every day? The prophets continue to remind us, as they did people of old, that the fast that is demanded of us is to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free. I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity, choices. Sometimes we need those shock tactics to make us listen and focus and realise the choices that are before us. And choosing for Jesus is certainly no easy road. It's no easy option. But we don't choose alone. Jesus gathers us with a whole community to help us. And then Jesus walks alongside us as we walk forward together.